From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here at the library in the African and Middle Eastern Division. Welcome to our program, co-sponsored with the European Division, with Professor James Loeffler, who will be talking about his new book, The Most Musical Nation, Jews, Culture, and Modernity in the Late Russian Empire. Some of the research for this book was carried out at the Library of Congress, including our division and the European Division. So I'm especially eager to learn about Professor Loeffler's findings, and the book will be available for sale after the lecture. And in fact, I think several copies have already sold before the lecture. That's a good sign. I want to just mention two upcoming programs that we're having. I have some flyers for a program that we'll have here in our reading room December 8th. Professor Annie Bloch from the University of Toulouse in France will be talking about French Jewish communities along the Mississippi River and the issue of belonging, based on a book that she has written. And also Professor Ileana Adler is sitting here in the audience. Professor Adler's at the University of Maryland. She will be speaking in March, and her topic will be on her new book on the education of Jewish girls in Tsarist Russia. Dr. Loeffler, a native Washingtonian, earned his undergraduate degree at Harvard University and his MA and Ph.D. from Columbia University. He studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem as a Dorot Foundation Fellow. As a Fulbright Scholar, he traveled to the Ukraine in 2003 and 2004 to document the forgotten history of Jewish music contained in newly opened archives in the former Soviet Union. Professor Loeffler has served as a music consultant to many organizations, including National Public Radio and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. He's also affiliated on a permanent basis with the Jewish Music Research Center at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. A trained pianist, historian, and musicologist, James Loeffler is the research director of Pro Musica Hebraica, a relatively new organization founded by Charles and Robin Krauthammer, dedicated to bringing neglected Jewish music to the concert hall. Performances take place at the Kennedy Center. The next one will be on November 18th and features a pre-concert lecture with Dr. Loeffler. Professor Loeffler is a very busy professional. In fact, he drove up this morning from the University of Virginia. So I'm grateful to him that he's given us the opportunity to hear about his research. Let me remind you that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And so now, Professor Loeffler.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearlstein, and also Dr. Mary Jane Deeb for hosting me today. It is a real treat to come to speak about this book and this research here, because it's a place I did a lot of the research for, and also because it occupies a larger place inside this research project than you might realize. You know, much of this was conducted in Russia and Ukraine, as you heard, but you know, going away sometimes reminds you of why home is great. And in my experience, there were many cases where I would find myself in a library there with no heat on a day like today, a little bit colder, looking for things and finding that, in fact, I'm just going to get on the internet and see if the Library of Congress has it, because I know that if it's here, it'll be easily accessible. with an incredible staff that will actually want to work with me to make the resources available. And you would be surprised, this is a long way of saying you would be surprised about the treasures that we have here from Russia, of Russian Judaica, musical manuscripts, and all kinds of sources, some of which I'll refer to in the talk today. So as I said, it's a real pleasure to come back and speak about it here. So the best way to introduce to you the subject of this book is to recall an old short story by Isaac Babel, the Russian Jewish writer. In his story Awakening from 1931, he describes one of the great cultural spectacles of his childhood in fin de siècle Odessa. In the course of 10 years or so, he tells us, our town supplied the concert platforms of the world with infant prodigies. From Odessa came Misha Elman, Ephraim Zimbalist, Osip Gabrilowitsch. Odessa witnessed the first steps of Yasha Heifetz. He contrasts these Jewish prodigies with his own alter ego's hilariously awful musical efforts. The sounds dripped from my fiddle like iron filings, causing even me excruciating agony. But father wouldn't give in. At home, there was no talk save of Misha Elman, exempted by the Tsar from military service. Zimbalist, father would have us known, had been presented to the King of England and had played at Buckingham Palace. The parents of Gabrilowitsch had bought 2 houses in St. Petersburg. Infant prodigies brought wealth to their parents, but though my father could have reconciled himself to poverty, fame he must have. So this is the key word for, in a certain sense, what this book is about, fame. And it's a word we don't normally associate with the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. Many of the classic images, pious yeshiva students, enraptured Hasidim, defiant young Jewish socialists, pathetic victims of pogroms, and so on and so forth, occupy our field of vision, and they leave little room for this conception of Jewish violinists who are dazzling the Tsars and the Russian public alike with their talents. But the truth of the matter is that Babel's portrait of the artist as a suffering young fiddle player derives from a true and startling fact of Russian Jewish life. Year after year, from the 1880s until the end of the Tsarist era, and well into the Soviet period, there was an unceasing stream of musical virtuosos that emerged from the Russian conservatories to parade across the stages of Odessa, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and on into the West. Cellist Gregor Piatigorsky, conductor Sergei Kusevitsky, Vladimir Horowitz, David Oistrach, Evgeny Kissin, the list goes on and on and on. To be sure, not every Russian Jew was a musical genius, and this is why Babel's story is so enchanting, because he's describing his suffering as one of the ones who wasn't gifted, but is forced into musical lessons. But the pattern of Jewish overrepresentation, if you will, in classical music ran as wide as it did deep. It peaked in particularly dramatic fashion just before the Russian Revolution. Less than 5% of the total Russian population at the time, Jews numbered over 50% of the students at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Because of this, a joke made the rounds that it was the only school in the Russian Empire with a quota for non-Jewish students. And the number of Jewish students enrolled at music conservatories and schools across other cities in the empire was equally large. In Odessa, the situation reached the point of absurdity. With 84% of the student body Jewish, in 1916, the conservatory decided to enact a new program of what we would call affirmative action through scholarships for ethnic Russian students. This wasn't a quota to restrict Jewish admission there, as happened at many, many other universities, was the norm. But in fact, it was an attempt to basically still have this influx of Jewish students, but somehow fix the numbers. Now, you can imagine Jewish visibility in a society that is plagued with a huge current of anti-Semitism had an obvious downside. Charges of Jewish opportunism were common, particularly since a conservatory degree provided a draft deferment and a legal pathway out of the Pale of Settlement, the region on the western borderlands of Russia, where Jews were restricted by law to live. Then, of course, there are the professional anti-Semites. A good example of this is the critic Emile Buettner. He was a leading member of the Russian symbolist movement of poets and artists, and he was the brother of the composer and pianist Nikolai Buettner. But Emile was more well known at the time in Russia for his writings about what he described as the plague of little Jewish boys from Lodz who were ruining Russian music with their, quote, Asiatic and barbarous ways. Now, I could go on with example after example of these theories of anti-Semites about why there were so many Jews in music. But one of the striking things is that even the friends of the Jews in this period in time were also captive to kind of mythical explanations of Jewish achievement. A good example of this is Alexander Scriabin, the great Russian composer, who on the one hand spoke out against any attempts to discriminate against Jews in the path into the musical profession. On the other hand, he explained this as a necessity because, quote, without Jews, music would have no future. And then he went on to say this is because the Jews are biologically feminine by racial character, which predisposes them to sensitive lyrical instruments. And then he gives this fascinating formula where he says, for an orchestra to sound right, it must have no less than 15% Jews in the string and horn sections. So the question is, how do we explain the special relationship between Jews and music? One way is to look back at the man who birthed this whole process of Jews entering into classical music in the Russian Empire, and actually birthed, in a certain sense, the modern profession of classical music in Russia. So the man I'm talking about, his image is up there now, is Anton Rubinstein. Now, while his name is barely remembered today, and he's typically confused with another great Jewish musician, another pianist of no relation, Arthur Rubinstein, in the second half of the 19th century, Anton stood virtually without equal as a pianist in Europe. He was considered by many to be the sole successor of Franz Liszt, and he was someone who had a kind of colorful, titanic personality that dominated countless accounts of his performances and his kind of grand persona and his talents, prodigious talents as a pianist. For decades across Russia, you could find his photograph hanging in the homes of what we would call middle-class Russian families, particularly because he was regarded as a very handsome person. As you can see from his visage, the nickname he had was Van II, as in Ludwig van Beethoven, because he was understood to be bearing a striking resemblance to Beethoven. Now, what's interesting about Rubinstein is that he starts life in a shtetl, in a place that we would think of as the quintessence of the Pale of Settlement. He is born into a Jewish family and then baptized as an infant, which was an unusual but not impossible, in fact, occurred to a certain degree among a certain stratum of Russian Jews. Baptism took place in the 19th century, conversion to Christianity. So his parents baptized him and brought him to Moscow, and he was reared there and in Berlin. The result was a classic European Jewish cosmopolitan, a terrific artist who never really fit into any one culture. And I could give you my words, but the best are just his words to describe his own identity. He said, to the Jews, I'm a Christian, to the Christians, a Jew. To the Russians, I'm a German, to the Germans, a Russian. For the classicists, I'm an innovator, even an avant-gardist we might translate it as. For the musical innovators, I'm an artistic reactionary, and so on. The conclusion, I am neither fish nor fowl, in essence, a pitiful creature. Now, he actually wasn't normally so self-deprecating, and he was prone to these types of bombastic statements, but also grand visions of how art would sort of solve his dilemma of where he fit in to Russia and to Europe. Everything he did, in a certain sense, also was on this grand scale. His compositions were designed to not only evoke the great spirit of Romantic era art, but he also wanted to write in every conceivable compositional genre and create a new one. This is the spiritual opera, which again, we don't know much about today, but in his own time was an attempt to fuse art and religion together to create the ultimate form of music, which coincidentally would take as its theme religion, Judaism, and Christianity, and fuse them together in a modern kind of art. When I say he was grand, it was also in his pianistic talents and his stamina. He came here to the United States once for a year-long tour sponsored by Steinway Pianos, and over the course of 239 days, he gave 215 concerts, which, as you can imagine, because of travel, meant that some days he was giving 2 to 3 concerts a day. And he worked his way through lots and lots of pianos in the process. Now, the reason he's interesting, on the one hand, is his kind of artistic vision of what he was as a composer who was part Jewish, part Christian, part Russian, part European, etc. But really, for the story I tell in the book, he's most important because his grandest dream was the idea of Russia having its own conservatory. And this ideal turned into reality in 1862 when the St. Petersburg Conservatory was launched. What is striking about it was that it immediately emerged as what we could call essentially an instrument of artistic emancipation for Jews and Russians and many other groups alike. With the reputation as particularly liberal and tolerant and open, it proved singularly popular for Jews in Russia. In the 5 decades before 1917, Jews began to flock in increasingly large numbers to St. Petersburg and then to other conservatories that sprouted up in other cities across Russia to seek the same path of fame and a career and entering into the world of classical music. So one of the things I tried to do in this book is understand, after looking not only at the famous stories, but the thousands of personal biographies that are encoded in the registration documents of students who went to these schools, to figure out what is inspiring them to do this. And this is one of the virtues for anyone who has spent time researching in Russia. You know, one of the virtues of the Tsarist system is that they kept paper, everything in paper was preserved, and people were controlled through documents. You had to have a piece of paper to show up anywhere. And these papers give us story after story of individuals who chose music. So why did they choose music? In one sense, it's clear that music simply offered a tangible form of personal advancement. As I alluded to a few minutes ago, if you chose music as a career, it was one area where you could actually get out of the pale of settlement, and you could enter into a university-level institution even when other universities in Russia had begun to be closed off to the Jews. But there was something else going on with it, and it had to do with the idea that music was, in a certain sense, neutral. Right? Art and music offered a tantalizing promise of transcendence, an idea that you could become simply, as Rubinstein argued, a free artist, which was a novel concept in a regime that was still what we would essentially characterize as ancien regime, still locked in a system of estates and social orders in very fixed categories, even as they were starting to collapse under the weight of industrialization and all the other dramatic forces in Russian society in the 19th century. The very neutrality of classical music meant that Jewish musicians didn't have to sort of check their identities at the door, and the fact that it was in a language that wasn't a language meant that, unlike writers, for instance, who were constantly agonizing over which language to write in, German, Yiddish, Hebrew, French, Russian, this didn't seem to apply in a basic sense. One of the other things I would note about this is that music was open in a sense, not just that it encouraged Jews to attend, but the musical profession and the people who joined Rubinstein in trying to build these conservatories and these music schools were determined that they would essentially be egalitarian, both to Jews and other minority groups, but also to men and women. It's very striking that women were admitted in equal numbers as well, in stark contrast to nearly every other institution of this kind in Russia. Now, if there's this aspect of liberalism or liberal thinking that took place there was certainly another aspect as well, which is Russian nationalism. We tend to think about the great Russian composers as people who were inspired by kind of a romantic era love of expressing the soul and a kind of love for reaching for the highest realms of art and humanity. But of course, most of them were pretty nasty people who were intent on policing the borders of Russian music. And when we think about people like Modest Mussorgsky, Emile Buettner, and many of the great Russian composers, they were all the enemies of Rubinstein. When the conservatory had barely been opened, they were already denouncing it as a synagogue run by the rabbi, Rubinstein, where foreign Yankels would be flooding in to ruin Russian music because they didn't belong and because they were incapable of creating true art. This is a trope that began to be voiced already in the 1850s, before the conservatory was properly open, and continued all the way through. One of the striking things about it is that this sentiment doesn't stop Jews from getting into the conservatories, but it does begin to kind of worm its way into the consciousness of many of these musicians. I'm going to turn now and give you another photo to look at. And what we're looking at here is a picture of two of the iconic Russian composers. They are not as nasty men as some of the others I just mentioned. With the white beard in the middle is Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was understood to be sort of the great father figure for a whole generation of Russian conservatory students. And next to him, with his arms crossed, looking away in a kind of grumpy fashion, is Alexander Glazunov, who went on to be director of the conservatory and also legendary among really 2.5 generations of Russian students, and also, of course, these are major composers. Surrounding them are their students. And if you look at the students, you find a number of the people who go on to be quite famous as Russian Jewish musicians. Now, these are, in a certain sense, Anton Rubinstein's spiritual children. It's the next generation, and this is a picture taken, I believe, in 1903. And it shows, a sense of fraternity, right? Here are the composers, the professors, surrounded by their brood of students. But in spite of this, and in spite of the fact that, as I said to you, the St. Petersburg Conservatory becomes such a receptive place and almost, in a certain sense, a haven for Jewish musicians in a time when anti-Semitism is rising in Russia, the questions about why there were so many of them and the lingering polemics of anti-Semites, which eventually traced their way back to Richard Wagner, the idea that Jews really didn't belong and they really didn't have a place in Russian art, echoed more and more loudly in these years. This brings me to the riddle that I use as the title of the book I'm speaking to you about today, The Most Musical Nation. And it's the riddle of why there were so many Jewish musicians here, but there was very little in the way of Jewish classical music to speak of. The quote comes from a newspaper article written in St. Petersburg by a Jewish critic at the time who said, "They say we Jews are the most musical nation, that the violin is our national instrument. We have given the world composers of genius. We have more professional musicians among us than any other people. And at the same time, you'll hardly find another nation whose national music has been so much neglected as ours." So in a world in which art is connected to nationhood, right, and these composers are judged by how much they express the Russian soul, to express truly Jewish classical music, they had to tap into the Jewish folk soul. In 1908, a group of these students, several of them are pictured here. Let me try and figure this out. To the left of Rimsky-Korsakov is a young man named Mikhail Gnesin, and to his left is someone named Solomon Rozovsky. These are two men who in 1908 banded together to create something called the Society for Jewish Folk Music. Their goal was to launch a movement for Jewish music. And very quickly, they spawned chapters across Russia and assembled a whole bunch of colleagues in order to basically create modern Jewish classical music. It's important to understand for a second what these people were and what they were not. We may think of them as passionate young nationalists or a defiant, vulnerable minority, but they were actually the elite of the Russian musical world. These are the friends, first of all, these are the disciples of Rimsky-Korsakov and Glazunov. These are the friends and rivals of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, people we know very well. And these are people who are making names for themselves already as a kind of young vanguard of Russian classical music. But even as they don't turn away from that path and that goal, they begin to also kind of alongside it bring in this quest to start writing Jewish works. And to do this, they go out into the shtetls, hauling large phonographs to record the voices of Yiddish folk songs, nigunim from the Hasidic world, klezmer, folk instrumental melodies, and so on, and to create out of this songs, chamber pieces, choral arrangements, symphonies, and eventually operas. The interesting thing about this story is it takes place in an incredibly turbulent time. In fact, much of their work takes place during World War I. And while the Pale of Settlement is being overrun by successive waves of armies, and while the Jews there are suffering incredible privation, these composers are actually continuing to publish music and to produce concerts, outdoor symphony concerts taking place in St. Petersburg, both to raise money as a philanthropic endeavor and because they believe that the fact that the world of the shtetl is now under physical assault and is the battleground for World War I means that they must rescue and preserve the sounds of it even more earnestly and quickly. Now, the interesting thing about this group of composers, and for the sake of time, I'm going to just mention one here and play you a short example because I want to have time to take some questions about this whole swirl of different stories in this book. But the interesting thing about them is they look both backwards and forwards at the same time. When you think about their vision, it's one of trying to recover the world of Jewish musical liturgy, the world of Yiddish folk songs, a world in which they themselves, now having moved into modern art, are already standing at a remove from. At the same time, they want to bring that traditional folklore into modern artistic terms. In this sense, they're kind of in between the model of what we would say is 19th century Russian music, Romanticism, and the modernist currents which are beginning to emerge. Now, if we want to understand what this means, we can turn to one good example, and that is the music of Alexander Crane. Right now, I believe you're seeing a truncated version of him. So the man with the dark mustache is Alexander Abramovich Crane. Or I should say the man with the dark mustache and the tunic-style shirt standing. Who was he? He was born in 1883, the son of a Jewish folk musician who spent his childhood playing in a klezmer ensemble, a traditional childhood playing weddings, in a world of basically Jewish Ashkenazi folk tradition, very far removed from anything resembling the world of St. Petersburg and the cosmopolitanism of European classical music and things like that. But he moves on to the conservatory in Moscow, and along with a number of his siblings, he's one of 9 children, 6 of them become famous as professional musicians in Russia. One of them, the bald gentleman, becomes, that's his brother, David, who becomes the concertmaster of the Bolshoi Opera Orchestra. Alexander enters the Moscow Conservatory in 1896. He graduates in 1908, and by the time he graduates, he's already become regarded as one of the great young composers, a disciple of Scriabin, who's creating this new form of modernist art. What does that mean? It means a style of music that's influenced, in a sense, more by Debussy, by Ravel, by some of the ideas about lyricism, by some of the ideas about shifting tonality, and is trying to kind of break down some of the realism of 19th century art. But the interesting thing about him is that he's also influenced by Jewish musical folklore, and he's determined to bring that into his art as well. So I'm going to pause and play a short excerpt from one of his pieces written at the time. So what are we hearing? Right? First of all, it's a piece called Jewish Sketches, written in 1910. It's clarinet and string quartet. What we're hearing, first of all, is the sound of someone who has studied Brahms, right? It sounds someone who studied 19th century chamber music and is basically borrowing a model we've seen before. The clarinet, the quintet, the clarinet and string quartet is a very classic model. What you hear is, particularly in the clarinet lines, he's woven into it the tonality, the inflections, and most of all, the scales that come from traditional East European Jewish folk music. And the idea is to create a language that, in a certain sense, blurs the borderlines between what we think of as classical music and what we think of as Jewish folk tradition. He's not alone in doing this, of course, right? Bartók is doing this. Many European composers are doing this. It is not that that every 20th century composer working in a national idiom isn't doing this. It's just striking because it's music that we don't hear much about. One of the things that drew me to this research was not only the kind of social historical question about, well, why did Jews become so prominent in this field of Russian culture, but also what was it that they were trying to create as an art form that would somehow kind of harmonize this world of folk tradition with modern art, and what was it about it that made it disappear? Why don't we know more about it? The shorter answer to that is that it's in my book, what happened to this and why we don't know about it. But in one sense, what happened is Crane and all of his fellow composers and all of his musicians went through the maelstrom of the Russian Revolution. Now, they came out the other side and they weren't immediately suppressed or silenced. One of the things that people often miss about what happens for Jews in the Soviet Union was that they are not, from the get-go, suddenly a target of the regime. Instead, what they are is cast in this very weird role where the Soviet authorities, on the one hand, want to promote Jewish culture and Jewish artists because this is a way to show the world the progressive face of their empire. On the other hand, they are suspicious of it. And they're suspicious of it basically because there's a continuity in terms of anti-Semitism, an idea that there's somehow a problem here, that there are too many Jews, and that at the extreme this is a conspiracy, and in milder forms this is just unseemly, that there ought to be more ethnic Russians who are populating the orchestras. Now, the Soviets can never make up their minds about this because, on the one hand, they see this as a value, right? And one way to look at this is to look briefly at what happens with Comrade Stalin. And I'm going to close by saying a few words about him and his relationship to Jewish musicians and Jewish music. Before I do that, actually, let me just mention Crane. So Crane is a perfect example of this. In the 1920s and 30s, his music is performed to large audiences. It's published. He becomes a prize-winning artist and composer. And he continues to compose. But progressively, over the course of the 30s and 40s, essentially, he begins to practice self-censorship. And so the Jewish theme in his music begins to disappear. His involvement in Jewish cultural life begins to disappear. And the price of survival is basically a kind of self-imposed silence, as well as some pretty blatant forms of propagandistic art, writing some works in honor of Lenin and Stalin and things like that. Stalin. Stalin is a strange figure because as one of the worst dictators of the 20th century, who engages in lots and lots of anti-Semitic repression, he loves Jewish musicians. Right? His favorite musical comedian is Leonid Uchosov, whose picture I don't have, but is a Jew from Odessa, back in the day that Babel is describing, who basically introduces jazz to the Soviet Union and introduces klezmer melodies into Soviet popular song and makes a lot of Hollywood-style comedies that Stalin loves. Stalin's favorite pianist, of course, is Maria Udana, who is also a Russian Jewish pianist, a fascinating, defiant artist who is a very controversial figure, but whose music he loves. And it's said that when Stalin dies in 1953, it's a recording of Mozart's piano concerto, which is on his record player spinning, made by Udana. Of course, it's also said that this is a recording that didn't exist until a few days before, when he heard a live performance on the radio, and Stalin, being dictator, said, "Bring me that record." And the record didn't exist. And so they called the pianist and the orchestra back into the studio and had them make the record, and then they presented him a copy of the record the next day. That's what you can do when you're a dictator. But the point is that Stalin loved individual Jewish musicians, even though he was part of a process of trying to basically, once and for all, strip the conservatories of this awkward number of so many Jews, to repress Jewish culture and Jewish music, and to strip it out of the great Soviet encyclopedia, so Jewish music doesn't formally exist as a concept. and to do all of these things to kind of put an end to this very complicated and elaborate chain of cultural influence and involvement of Jews in Russian society that goes back, as I've said, to the mid-19th century. But he didn't succeed. And he didn't succeed because, in a certain sense, Jews were so woven into the fabric of Russian and Soviet culture as insiders and outsiders simultaneously. If there's one thing that comes out, I think, of this story, it's that paradox, that these were people who all, particularly in the Soviet period, walked around marked, in a certain sense, as Jewish, in that case by a line on their passport, and yet were allowed into the inner sanctum of Russian art. More than that, they came to represent Russianness in a kind of striking way. One of the great images of the 40s and 50s and really the 60s is of all these heroic performances by great Russian Jewish musicians, David Oistrakh, Emile Buettner, all these great pianists and violinists. And they come out of the Soviet Union to win the prizes and to record and to tour the US and to promote fraternal relations and to play Tchaikovsky and the great Russian composers. And this, of course, is most famously summed up by Isaac Stern, our great American classical violinist, Jewish, also born in Ukraine, Russian Ukraine, who said that, of course, Soviet-American cultural diplomacy really consists of one thing. They send us their Jewish musicians from Odessa, and we send them our Jewish musicians from Odessa. And that sums up, in a certain sense, that whole process and the whole story, and I think Babel couldn't have said it better. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. All right. Any questions? I have one, but I'll wait.
Hi, Elaine.
Thank you very much. You raised this, you answered some of the questions you raised, and some you didn't have time to answer, but this sort of tantalizing question that you raised about where did it all come from? There's a certain amount of opportunism. It was a way to get ahead, or to even get anywhere, to get out of the tail. And there's some Klezmer roots, but where do the Jews become this musical
Right.
foundation?
It's a great question. Should I repeat it?
Yeah.
But the question is this question I raised and didn't fully answer, which is where does it really come from, right? There are certain factors that clearly encourage people to seek educational opportunities because it brings with it tangible social and legal benefits. There's a cultural tradition inside Jewish society in Eastern Europe of strong emphasis on music and a professional class of musicians, but still, where does it come from? The first thing I would say is if you read the applications of all of these students, what you see is a real diversity of factors and motivations. What's interesting is some of these people clearly say, I am a student who has already devoted 10 years of my life to learning the piano or studying the cello in Kiev or so in such a place, and I want to further my education. And that's all they say. And they seem to be basically, they want to be musicians. There are some people, interestingly enough, more than a few, who say, I wish to become a cantor and serve in the synagogue, and I need further musical training. So it's not something we would imagine, because I've emphasized that this is a story about Jews kind of leaving the Jewish world to go into the broader world. But many of them went to the conservatory, stating at least that I wish to go and become a religious, liturgical performer in the Jewish world, and I'm going to go study harmony and singing and solfege in Moscow to do it. So it points to a kind of diversity of motivations. But I think there's another factor. One other factor is myth, right? And I often put this in terms of the idea that sometimes people begin to Jews begin to believe the myths about them. And I think they begin to believe the myth that they have a kind of intrinsic musical talent, and as a result, that spurs them onwards, right? I'm not a social psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, but you're all familiar with questions we have when we talk about why minority groups gravitate to certain professions, right, in various societies. And there are people who explain it structurally. Well, it's because that's where the opportunity is. And sometimes it's also explained in terms of, well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once there's a phenomenon, even a small one, and there's commentary upon it, people begin to internalize some of that idea. Well, here's what I should do because this is what other people are doing. Now, sometimes this plays out negatively and sometimes positively. I think the story of Jews in music is both. You know, it inspires some people to clearly say, well, why shouldn't I do this? Because look at all the people before me who've left Kiev to go to the conservatory in St. Petersburg. But to some extent, it also generates this self-consciousness that why are there so many of us? And maybe there is something strange going on with this. So I do think that there are kind of broad factors, and then there's kind of a cultural myth, or if you want to just call it a cultural trope, a meme that takes off and kind of inspires a lot of these people to say, well, this is a way to do it because there's a precedent and because there's a receptivity to it. The last thing I'll say about this is, this isn't just what they're encountering being written about in the newspaper. Their teachers are encouraging them. Every single one of these composers, those who are great fans of the Jews and those who are not, believe that the Jews have great talent, and they tell them that again and again and again. So if you go back to Gnesen, sitting there to the left of Rimsky-Korsakov, you know, he writes in his memoirs, which he doesn't publish, these very awkward conversations he has with his teachers who say, well, yes, there is something unique, special about you. You all have this talent, you all, right? And that kind of thing. And it kind of, the negative side of it is it begins to put Jews into a category as almost culturally, if not racially different. The positive side is it actually inspires some of them to think of themselves as a people of natural music ability and results in this kind of proclivity for it.
I want to follow up on that question in the sense of asking, when does it all start? I know your focus is 19th century primarily,
Right.
isn't it? But was there a particular, wave that began at a certain point, or was that true also for the Baroque period?
Right. It's a very interesting question. The larger issue of when Jews sort of begin to appear in such dramatic numbers in the European sphere of classical music. And the answer is it does go back further if you look elsewhere. Right? The classic example is in the Italian Renaissance, where you begin to see Jewish musicians appear as court musicians and gravitating towards this as a profession. These are very small communities in Italy, and those are some dramatic examples. It's not something that takes over society in a certain sense. And there it seems to be linked to a broader process of Renaissance, of secular learning and Jewish involvement in all kinds of other, let's call them mainstream pursuits. Germany, however, Central Europe is a more dramatic phenomenon. I mentioned in the book this incredible story that makes the rounds in the 1790s in Berlin of a Jew who wants to apply to the Music Academy in Berlin and is refused admission because he is told that it's mathematically impossible for Jews to compose music. And so not only is there an idea that there's this, social discrimination, but there's also this idea that Jews are not thought of as particularly musical in that society. But that's the point of change. And in the late 18th century, you start to see, more and more Jews becoming involved in musical life. Now, there's something striking. In German lands, this process has a lot to do with embourgeoisement. These are Jews who are moving into what we would call middle-class society, right? And they have a degree of status and degree of wealth that enables them and encourages them to seek Bildung, cultivation, learning, and so on and so forth. This is why, in particular, you also see a very striking presence of women in Central European classical music. Not just Felix Mendelssohn, but his sister, a composer in his own right and a salonière. In Russia, you see some of that, but it seems to be people who are aware that there's a lot of Jews and elsewhere in Europe who flock to music, but see themselves as part of a Russian story about something very new. Suddenly these conservatories are new. Suddenly there's an opportunity here. So it's part of a broader story, but it's one in which it kind of plays out in different ways in different contexts over time.
Yes.
I'd like to also continue on the same question and ask you whether you think there is something about being Jewish and celebrating Jewish services or holidays or living as a committed Jew that would kind of account for the fact that there was more of an interest in music, or there was more of a kind of an inclination
Right.
their life or religion or
Right. Yes and no. No, in the sense that, the Jews are, even within Europe, right, even in the 19th century, there's so much internal diversity. And one of the things you find is some of the people who flock to music the most in Central Europe have the least contact with synagogue life, right? And in Russia, it's a little bit different. So I don't think there's something intrinsic. But there are some factors, sure. One is that if you look at the Orthodox Church service, right, this is a service which is a Slavonic church service. It's about oral chanting. And the musical culture that develops among Russian folk culture is one in which it is about folk songs, singing, not so much about instrumental music. There are some among Ukrainian peasants have a really interesting tradition of instrumental music, but Russian peasants don't, and Jews do have it. So there is this profession of the klezmer, which appears earlier on in the Middle Ages and is kind of a folk musician who's really a professional musician in Ashkenazic society. There is the cantor also. However, the yes and no comes back into the picture here because these are professions which are not necessarily high status, particularly the klezmer, the fiddle player, right? And people often say, well, of course Jews became great violinists because they played fiddle, for centuries before that. But the fiddle player was a very low status profession, and the classic example is nobody wanted their daughter to marry a fiddle player. You can still see hints of that in the biography of Leonard Bernstein, who when he decides in Boston that he wants to become a musician, his father says, Mentonisht, don't do it. You shouldn't go there. A musician is not a good job. It's not, be a doctor, right? Be a professor, be a lawyer, be a businessman, and so on and so forth. So there is this tradition inside the Jewish world, but it's not necessarily a tradition that has high cultural status. And so it's a little bit of a mystery to figure out how that then gets put into the minds of these people, except to say they're looking for a way, as I would put it, to become modern, to become Russian without ceasing to be Jewish.
All right, I have one last question.
Yeah.
Today, there's so many Russian Jews who are violinists.
Yeah.
Well, if it was, if during the years of communism, it kind of receded, that Jewishness, what was happening?
Right. It's a good question. I'm tempted to.
It's 100 years beyond your time period.
Well, it is and it isn't. There's it reminds me of the joke. I have to tell the joke. When Russian Jews, Soviet Jews, began to leave the Soviet Union en masse and to come here and also to Israel and actually to Germany also and other places. There's a classic joke that says you see a whole bunch of Jews getting off the airplane in Tel Aviv, one by one with their violin cases. One goes off with a violin case, second with violin case, third with violin case, and the fourth comes off with nothing. And they say, "Where's the violin case?" And someone says, "He's a pianist." But it does continue. That's part of the story because there are attempts to, let's call it de-Judaize the profession. They don't succeed. Why is one of the things that's a very interesting question. Some of it has to do with the fact that, to put it crudely, there are just too many of them, right? Too many of the faculty are Jewish to do something without a drastic purge, and drastic purges end with the death of Stalin. But of course, that doesn't fully explain why Evgeny Kissin or many of the other phenomenal musicians we think about who are born in the 1970s or 80s continue to emerge. And there I would say, it has to do with sort of cultural sensibilities and cultural values and the appeal of this and the fact that there's this history, I think, that builds on. But it's certainly true that, it's said today, if you go to Juilliard in New York, the languages you hear are Russian, Hebrew, and Chinese. And there's a whole other story, which I don't tell in this book, but it's a great story about Asian Americans and Asians and classical music too. And the proclivity, the attraction, the dramatic influx that seems to come out of nowhere, and they're in a culture which doesn't have Western classical music until very recently. So it's not only a Jewish story, but it's an interesting one.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.